include the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women and the Cyrus Vance Centre for International Justice. So thank you all to our dear partners for making this possible today. We are meeting towards the conclusion of this year's Commission on the Status of Women, a moment that has already seen a very important milestone. Last Monday, as many of you know, well, Monday before last, Member States adopted agreed conclusions that we believe for the first time in recent history recognised in a deliberate and considered way the rights and needs of women who are criminalised and women who are in prison or detention within this super important global gender equality framework. And this for us marked a significant step forward in acknowledging a group that has too often been overlooked in gender and feminist forums. So with that in mind, let me first turn to our speakers. It's a pleasure to introduce Themba Maleka, Associate Director at Pathfinders. Please open the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. My name is Themba Maleka, and I'm Associate Director of Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Society. And it is my honor to welcome you to today's event. We convene on the final days of the 70th session on the Commission on the Status of Women, a session that has proven historic, contentious, and ultimately consequential for the women's rights agenda. CSW70 is taking place at a moment when the multilateral system is under strain. The rule of law declined globally for the 8th consecutive year in 2025, with widespread weakening of legislative, judicial, and executive accountability mechanisms. At CSW, the shift has been from advancing progress to defending hard-fought wins. Many diplomats devoted more energy to protecting previously agreed language than negotiating new standards. The agreed conclusions were adopted by a recorded vote, a reflection of the deepening geopolitical divisions and a departure from the usual consensus-based negotiation process. However, there is reason to acknowledge a genuine step forward on the issue we gather around today. For the first time, the CSW agreed conclusions explicitly address the criminalization and detention of women, calling on states to address root causes, the specific needs of women across the justice process, and accountability for abuse in custody settings. The agreed conclusions also call for comprehensive legislative reviews to amend criminal laws that have led to the disproportionate criminalization and incarceration of women, language many advocates have worked hard to protect. As the UN Secretary General's report ahead of CSW70 made clear, laws criminalizing poverty, this includes informal work, homelessness, begging, and non-payment of fines, disproportionately affect women and girls, deepening their exclusion from justice systems. This interaction of gender, poverty, and criminalization sits at the very heart of SDG 1 on poverty eradication, SDG 5 on gender equality, and SDG 16 on peace, justice, and inclusion. These goals remind us that justice and equality are foundational to achieving sustainable development for all. Yet, for too many women, the reality is that laws and policies continue to criminalize poverty, leaving them vulnerable to disproportionate punishment and exclusion from society. Justice systems that criminalize poverty are not only unjust, they are ineffective. When women are imprisoned for non-violent, poverty-related offenses, the harm ripples outwards to children, families, and communities, and societies as a whole. People-centered justice standards start from a simple premise. Justice systems exist to serve people, not the other way around. That means designing laws and policies and institutions around the lived realities of the most marginalized, including women facing the compounded injustices of poverty, discrimination, and criminalization. People-centered justice also means centering lived experience. The voices of women who have experienced incarceration are not just compelling, they are essential. Without their perspectives, policy reform risks missing the mark entirely. Women in detention face intersecting forms of discrimination that often intensify over their lives: gender inequality, poverty, racial and ethnic discrimination, and lack of access to legal aid. Inclusive justice systems must recognize these intersections and respond to them through investment in prevention, support, and rehabilitation. Today's event directly builds on the momentum of last year's CSW69 side event, where From Poverty to Punishment report was launched and wherein we initiated one of the first global high-level conversations at the UN on this issue. This year, with the adoption of the CSW agreed conclusions and explicit language on women in detention, we have a stronger normative foundation than ever before to build from. We are fortunate to have with us today voices from government, civil society, UN agencies, and most importantly, women with lived experience of incarceration. I want to express our sincere gratitude to the co-organizers, Penal Reform International and Women Beyond Walls, and to the co-sponsors, governments of Thailand, Colombia, Liechtenstein, and Romania. We thank UN Women, UNODC, OHCHR, UNDP, UNPPS, the Thailand Institute of Justice, ILANUD, the Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice, and International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women for their commitment to this agenda. I'll now hand back the floor to our moderator, Olivia, who will guide our discussion. Thank you, and I look forward to a productive and meaningful discussion.
Thank you, dear Timba, and for all of the collaboration, and we're proud to be a partner in the Justice Action Coalition and taking this forward within that as well. So now I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sheshai Shaiwaid, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Thailand to the UN, and we're grateful for your leadership, of course, please.
Thank you very much. The pronunciation is actually better than mine. Very good morning to all of you. And I just wanted to start by joining our previous speakers in extending a very warm welcome to all of you to this very important conversation. I would like to start also by expressing our thanks to your service, Mary Robinson, the Permanent Missions of Colombia, Romania, Liechtenstein, UN Women, UNODC, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNDP, Peace Building and Peace Support Office, Thailand Institute of Justice, as well as all the civil society partners for sharing the collective resolve of a better status of women behind bars and co-organizing this very important event. Thank you so much. Colleagues, Thailand is very proud to co-host this event for the second year running to highlight the plight that women in detention often face. Women's imprisonment rate has grown faster than men, oftentimes due to non-violent offenses and linked to poverty, inability to pay fines, punitive drug policy, so on and so forth. Advocated by Her Highness Princess Pachira Kitiyapa, the eldest daughter of His Majesty the King of Thailand, my government initiated the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, or the Bangkok Rules, which was adopted by consensus in the year 2010. Since its adoption, the Bangkok Rules has become an accepted standard for how women prisoners and offenders should be treated. In Thailand, in partnership with UNODC, has launched the Bangkok Rules Accelerator Program to support the implementation of the Bangkok Rules and to improve the situation of women deprived of liberty. And in accordance with this year's CSW priority theme, today's event is a unique opportunity for us to reflect on the progress and to recommit to improve the treatment and rights of women impacted by the criminal justice system. And as a member of the Human Rights Council for the term 2025 to 2027, Thailand will continue to put our best efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights of women in various contexts, and will continue to do our part to exchange best practices and further improve the implementation of the Bangkok Rules. I very much look forward to all the insights from today's discussion and hope that with the strong commitment from all of us here today together, we will continue to improve the life of women no matter who or where they are. Thank you very much and have a very good morning.
Thank you, Ambassador, and we deeply appreciate Thailand's leadership, and the Bangkok Rules, of course, was the foundation of much of this work where we are today. I would like to give the floor now to His Excellency Raul Sanchez, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Colombia to the UN, who has, together with Thailand, been on this journey with us the last 3 years at the CSW. So it's very fitting to have you also give welcoming remarks today, please.
Thank you, Ms. Robe, and thank you, Thema, for this invitation. And I want to also acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Chaibavi and Your Excellency President Robinson. It's an honor to be with you here now today. Ms. Dawn Harrington from Free Hearts, Ms. Lee from UNODC, Ms. Noera from the Thailand Institute of Justice. I would like to congratulate Penal Reform International, Women Beyond Walls, and Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies for convening this timely discussion, as well as to congratulate the missions and the organizers that to be engaged and to keep on engaging in this very important matter. It is an honor for Colombia to co-sponsor this event and to contribute to this discussion during this CSW, and in a very timely manner with very solid conclusions, as you mentioned, Tema, of how can we take forward this matter. This issue, as it was mentioned, is very urgent and deeply structural and very important for Colombia. Around the world, the number of women in prison has grown significantly over the past decades, yet most women deprived of liberty are not incarcerated for violent crimes. Instead, many are imprisoned for non-violent offenses, often linked to poverty, economic vulnerability, and the criminalization of survival strategies. These dynamics frequently intersect with discrimination, limited access to justice, and punitive policy responses that fail to account for the realities of women's lives. For Colombia, this conversation resonates strongly. Our country has learned in a very difficult manner, through decades of conflict, inequality, and displacement, that justice systems must not only respond to crime, but also recognize the structural conditions that shape people's lives, especially those of women facing multiple and intersecting forms of vulnerability. Evidence from Colombia has shown that many women in prison are not central actors in organized criminal networks. Instead, they often occupy the most precarious and peripheral roles in illegal economies, particularly in drug-related activities. At the same time, many are heads of household and primary caregivers, responsible for sustaining families and caring for children or other dependents. When these women are incarcerated, the consequences extend far beyond the individual, creating profound social and intergenerational impacts. Recognizing this reality, and as many of you are aware, Colombia adopted an important reform in 2023. We created the law 2292, known as the Public Utility Law, which introduced the possibility of substituting prison sentences for certain nonviolent offenses with supervised community service. This reform represents an important shift in criminal policy. Rather than responding to social vulnerability with incarceration, the law enables women, particularly those who are heads of household, to serve their sentence through community service while remaining connected to their families and caregiving responsibilities. 3 years after its adoption, the implementation of this law has already generated encouraging results. Judicial decisions have allowed women to benefit from this alternative sanction. Many have successfully completed their community service, and there has been no recorded recidivism among that case that had concluded. A central component of the reform has been the creation of a national network of community service placements, developed through partnerships with public institutions and civil society organizations across the country. These placements transform punishment from confinement into community contribution, allowing women to repair social ties while maintaining their roles within their families and communities. However, Colombia experience also reminds us that the legal reform alone is not enough. For alternatives to incarceration to succeed, women returning to their communities must have access to real opportunities, education, employment, psychosocial support, and social protection. Without these conditions, the structural factors that led to criminalization may persist. For this reason, Colombia has complemented this reform with territorial strategies that connect women with training programs, entrepreneurship initiatives, and restorative justice processes, seeking to ensure that the transition from prison to freedom becomes a pathway to reintegration rather than a return to vulnerability. At the international level, we believe this experience offers important lessons. Criminal justice reforms must be grounded in evidence about who women in prison actually are. They must incorporate a gender perspective that recognizes caregiving responsibilities and structural inequalities, and they must be accompanied by strong institutional and community-based support systems. As we advance the commitments of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 2030 Agenda, transforming justice systems is essential to ensure that no woman is punished simply for being poor, marginalized, or excluded. Colombia remains committed to working with partners such as Thailand and many other countries in the United Nations system, and also with civil society, to advance inclusive and gender-responsive justice systems that place dignity, equality, and social justice at their center. I thank you.
Thank you so much, and your commitment to ensuring access and collaboration with civil society is particularly welcomed in these difficult times for civil society. So now, it's my very great honour, I will try not to get shaky, to introduce our keynote speaker today. As you all know, an exceptionally distinguished global leader and a lifelong champion of human rights and gender equality, a real hero of mine. Mary Robinson, of course, served as the first woman president of Ireland, and later as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And throughout your remarkable career, you have been such a powerful and principled voice for constantly, for example, standing up for those who are often left at the margins, like the women who are criminalized or in detention. And we were especially privileged that Mary contributed the foreword to our pioneering report published last year, From Poverty to Punishment. Thank you. It is a true honour to have you here and to share your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia, for those warm words. Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. It's a privilege to join you all during the Commission on the Status of Women to discuss an issue that has for far too long remained on the margins of global conversations about gender equality, the criminalization and imprisonment of women. So it's wonderful to see this packed room and standing at the end. Luckily, they're mostly young, so young can stand. Today, more than 740,000 women and girls are held in prisons around the world. Over the past 2 decades, as we've heard, the number of women in prison has increased dramatically. Behind these numbers are human stories. These human stories are so often ones of women whose lives have been shaped by poverty, violence, discrimination, and exclusion. My dear friend Nelson Mandela once said, "Prison is designed to break one's spirit and destroy one's resolve, to stamp out that spark that makes each of us human." Yet for many women, that spirit has already been worn down long before they ever step inside a prison. In many cases, women are not imprisoned for serious violence. Instead, they are punished for acts closely linked to survival. Petty theft driven by poverty, working in the informal sector, the inability to pay fines, or low-level drug offences tied to economic hardship. What we're witnessing in many parts of the world is the criminalization of poverty. Some grumbling in the room. What we're witnessing in many parts of the world is the criminalization of poverty. And poverty, as we know, is not gender neutral. The 2025 report that you mentioned, Olivia, From Poverty to Punishment, from Penal Reform International and Women Beyond Walls, documents how laws and policies across many countries disproportionately criminalize women because of poverty, vulnerability, and socially constructed expectations about women's role and behaviour. Too often, criminal law becomes a blunt instrument used to manage social problems that should instead be addressed through equality, social protection, and care. And we call that use of the law the justice system. This is not justice, it is a failure of justice. When I was President of Ireland, I made it a tradition to visit the Dóchas Centre at Mountjoy Prison on the day we call Nollaig na Mán, the Women's Christmas, the 6th of January. I drank cups of tea with women who were intelligent, funny, resilient, and full of potential. But it was also clear that many of these women had experienced enormous hardship long before they arrived at prison. I wish I could say things have changed globally since the 1990s. They haven't. The number of women in prison globally rising by nearly 60% since 2000, a rate far higher, as we've heard, than the increase in the male prison population. But for many years, women affected by the criminal justice system have remained largely invisible within global conversations about women's rights. Encouragingly, this is really beginning to change, thanks to everyone in this room who has been part of that change. Last week, as we've heard, at the 70th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, we saw an important step, and a step forward with the recognition of criminalization and detention of women reflected in the agreed conclusions. This recognition is significant. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first time these issues have been reflected so clearly in the agreed conclusions. And we should be honest about how we arrived here. This progress has not been driven by governments, with a few notable exceptions. It has been driven by the trailblazing work of civil society organizations. And I would just like to single out my two friends, the co-founders of Women Beyond Walls, Sabrina Mahatani and Laura Cook, partly because they'd be cross that I mentioned them. And it's been driven too by women who have themselves long lived experience of criminal legal systems. And so I'm glad to see that we are going to be joined by Dawn, whom I met yesterday, and I look forward to hearing from her. I want to recognise all those who have organised, spoken out, and insisted that their voices be heard across traditional silos. Women with lived experience, lawyers, academics, activists, policymakers. Lasting reform will only happen when different groups work together. I'd also like to acknowledge the UN experts and networks who, ahead of this CSW, called attention to the urgent need to address the criminalization of women and the conditions they face in detention. Their advocacy has helped bring this issue into the global conversation where it belongs. And UN partners, supporting this discussion today, you have an important role in carrying this work forward. Thank you to a number of you, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the United Nations Development Programme, and the many governments and organisations co-sponsoring this event, and of course, UN Women. The mandate of UN Women is to advance women's rights, gender equality, and the empowerment of all women and girls. All women and girls. That word all matters. All women and girls must include women who have been criminalised. They must include women who have been detained. Because a movement for gender equality that overlooks these women is by definition incomplete. And funders in the room, and listening to this conversation online, your role is critical too. We know that the organisations working closest to women affected by the criminal justice system are often those with the least secure resources. A 2021 report by Women Beyond Walls surveyed organisations across 24 countries and found that 61% were operating in precarious funding conditions and 71% received no support from foundations that identify as women's rights or feminist funders. When the Legal Empowerment Fund launched its first global call for proposals in 2022, more than 4,800 grassroots groups from 153 countries applied, requesting over $233 million to support legal empowerment efforts in their communities. Yet only 5 million was available, reaching just 145 organisations. I have to say that is a lot of unmet need. The 2025 research by ODI Global on the state of justice financing reminds us that the problem is not only how much we spend, but where funding goes. Even among OECD countries, spending on frontline justice services remains below the Justice Action Coalition's recommended 2.5% of justice budgets. In many middle-income countries, spending on these services is around 0.1%, 20 times less. So if we're serious about justice and about gender equality, then more resources must reach the organisations and movements working on the front lines. I do understand the pressure governments and funders are facing. We're meeting at a time when the world faces immense challenges: war, climate change, rising inequality, and growing instability. But increasingly we see how these crises intersect. In many communities, the women most likely to be criminalised are also those on the front lines of economic hardship, of displacement, and of environmental change. It can be easy to focus only on the most visible crises, but that is precisely why we must remain vigilant about those whose suffering takes place out of sight. The measure of a society is not only to respond to global crises, it's also how it treats those who are most vulnerable. And nowhere is this more clearly reflected than in the way societies treat those who are imprisoned. Justice cannot mean punishing people for poverty. It cannot mean criminalizing survival. The promise of human rights, the promise at the heart of the United Nations, is that every person possesses inherent dignity and equal worth. That promise must extend to those women behind prison walls. The truth is, if we seek gender equality for all, then justice systems should never punish women for surviving poverty, nor for the fact of being women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary, for those rather powerful remarks and your insights on all the kind of intersecting crises that we're facing. It's very true. And I think one thing that really resonates for all of us in this room and listening online is that we all have a role. We all have a role in this story. And I think that's part of our job, the co-organisers, is to bring us all together from different sectors from different institutions to say that this is prison, as our stickers that we've thrown around the room, prison is a feminist issue, and I think your insights have really resonated in that way. So thank you, Mary. Well, building on many of these points that Mary has raised, I would now like to turn to our distinguished panellists who can dive a bit deeper into how we can advance gender-responsive real justice. And first, Dawn Harrington, Executive Director of Free Hearts and Director of Special Projects for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. You're very welcome here today, Dawn, and I would like to give you the floor to make your remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Dawn Harrington, and I come to you as a formerly incarcerated woman, the Executive Director of Free Hearts, the Special Projects Manager for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and we are members of the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, a global network of women from over 30 countries who have lived this reality, and we are working together to transform it. I stand here not just with my own story, but in connection with women around the world who are navigating these same systems, the same patterns, and the same injustices, just in different places. Before I was incarcerated, I worked for artists. But when I was arrested, none of that mattered. My bail was set at $100,000. And in that moment, my life, my freedom, was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about whether I could afford to come home. And through the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, I've come to understand that this is not just my story. It is shared by our sisters in the Philippines, because the United States and the Philippines are the only two countries in the world that rely on for-profit money bail systems, where freedom is directly tied to money. And our sisters in Haiti have shared something just as devastating, where prolonged preventative detention is the norm, with over 80% of people held without conviction, often for years in some cases. They are not just waiting, they are being held in a system where you may have to pay bribes to judicial officials to have their cases heard or to secure release. And this is no different from what is happening in the United States right now, where people are actually paying the federal government for clemency. So whether it is bail, bribes, or paid clemency, the message is the same across borders. Oftentimes, your freedom depends on what you can pay. I had a public defender, and I want to say this clearly. Many public defenders are brilliant, committed, and deeply care. But they are overwhelmed, under-resourced, and carrying impossible caseloads. So even access to justice becomes unequal. Not because they don't care, but because the system is built in a way that ensures some people will fall through. And while many countries have established public defense systems, the challenges of underfunding, high caseloads, and better outcomes for wealthy people facing charges are widespread issues globally, such as in the United Kingdom and other nations where legal aid systems are under severe strain. This is what the criminalization of poverty looks like. People criminalize not because they're dangerous, but because they're poor. And what happens next is a cascade. You lose your job, you lose your housing, you lose your stability, you accumulate debt. And for women, including trans women and non-binary people, there's another layer. You risk losing your children. You risk losing your custody. You risk losing your role as the center of your family and the center of your community. Children are displaced. Care structures collapse. Communities absorb the harm. Through the international network, we hear this same story across countries. Different legal systems, same outcome. Your freedom is determined by your access to resources. In Tennessee, where Free Hearts is based, we documented this reality in our participatory research report, The Criminalization of Poverty in Tennessee. We found that poverty itself is treated as a crime. You are criminalized for being poor, and then the system extracts from you at every step, creating a compounding effect that permanently traps you in this same condition. And we cannot talk about this system locally or globally without naming one of its most powerful drivers, the war on drugs. Because despite its name, the war on drugs has never been really about drugs. It is and has always been a war on the poor. And across countries, we see it clearly. It has also been a war on women navigating poverty, a war on women navigating trauma, a war on women carrying the weight of families without support. Globally, the rate of women's incarceration has grown dramatically by as much as 600 to 800% since the 1980s, driven largely in part by drug policies that criminalize addiction, pregnancy, and the marginal roles women occupy in survival economies. Through the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, we see how drug policies across the world have expanded punishment instead of care, especially for women. If a woman from my community that has resources or from a wealthier community and they struggle with substance abuse, she's often diverted into treatment. She could go to Malibu and have a fancy rehabilitation center, the most fancy that money can buy. She's often able to do this in privacy and to be cared for deeply. But if she's poor, she's criminalized. She is arrested. She is incarcerated. She is separated from her children and her community. And instead of treatment, she's given punishment. The difference between treatment and incarceration is often one thing: money. We know from our work that substance use, mental health, trauma, these are public health issues, but they are criminalized when they show up in poor and working class communities. Across countries, women are being incarcerated for transgressions directly tied to survival, poverty, and lack of access to care. Women are often criminalized not just for what they do, but for what they're expected to prevent. Prosecuted under failure to protect laws. Women criminalized for surviving domestic violence. Women criminalized because they're coerced into situations they cannot safely leave because they lack financial resources. So survival itself becomes criminalized. We also see the criminalization of homelessness in survival economies. Women doing what they must to survive and feed their families and being punished for it. And every interaction with the system comes with a cost, and even non-payment of that cost, carceral debt is criminalized. Through the international network, we see different versions of this everywhere. Different forms, same logic. Across countries, it's a two-tier system. One for people with money, and one that was met with care, and one for the women without money that's met with punishment. At Free Hearts, we see this every day, and we build alternatives. Through policy change, participatory defense, bail support, housing, alternatives to incarceration, direct services, and we are working, and also, I should say, cooperative economic development. We're working to interrupt this cycle, to bring women home, to stabilize families, and to create pathways that do not rely on punishment. Because we know this deeply. When women are supported, families stay together. When family stays together, communities are stronger. And throughout the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, we are building that vision globally, connecting local struggles to global change. Because the women closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And what we're saying across Tennessee, around the United States, and across the world is this: we cannot continue to criminalize poverty. We cannot continue to criminalize women for surviving. We cannot continue to wage wars on the poor and call it justice. Instead, we must invest in what actually creates safety, housing, healthcare, mental health support, treatment and programming, economic opportunity, and community. Because safety does not come from cages. It comes from stability. It comes from sisterhood. And it comes from ensuring that no one's freedom anywhere in the world is determined by how much money we have. I'll end where I began. When my bail was set at $100,000, the system told me what my freedom was worth. But what we know and what we're fighting for across borders is this: freedom should not depend on your income, and justice should never be for sale. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for saying it how it is. And we as civil society need your expertise, we need your recommendations, we need your analysis. And I would say the UN system needs it too, and governments need it, and that's why we're so grateful to have your leadership and all the sisters in the international network who are just growing bigger and bolder and wiser, and it's amazing. So our commitment, I think, is to make sure that none of these conversations ever happen without a member of the network here, and I think we should all commit to that together. So thank you very much. And that's a perfect segue to UNODC. It's a call to you also, of course. No, I'm really pleased to welcome you. Thank you for your co-sponsorship and your support over the years around the Bangkok Rules. And I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Xiao Hong Lee, the head of UNODC here in New York, please.
Thank you, Olivia, for introducing me and also for giving me the floor. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and ladies and gentlemen, I wish to begin with a sincere appreciation to Penal Reform International, Women Beyond the Walls, and also Pathfinders, and all other co-sponsors for convening this very important and timely event. UNODC, also with the full name of UN Office on Drugs and Crime, is honored to co-organize this event, especially or particularly at the moment when women and girls' experience with the criminal justice system demand sustained attention and practical solutions. So as previous speakers stated just now, women and girls experience gender-specific pathways that may lead to criminality, including poverty and discrimination. Once in contact with the criminal justice system, they may further encounter systemic barriers such as gender-insensitive policing, limited access to legal aid, discriminatory sentences, and also overuse of pre-trial detention and inadequate detention conditions and treatment. So we also heard this from Dow. And in addition, women and girls in conflict with the law generally face heightened stigmatization and exclusion, increasing their vulnerability and limited prospects for a successful reintegration into society. Despite these challenges, women and girl offenders often remain overlooked in global discussion on this topic. So it is therefore encouraging that this year's Commission on Status of Women agreed conclusion recognize the gender-specific challenges faced by the women and girls in conflict with the law, including roles in prison. This provides important momentum for strengthening gender-responsive approaches across criminal systems. And the member states have already taken actions to address these challenges. So, as mentioned and shared by the permanent representative of Thailand just now, the UN rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders. So the so-called Bangkok Rules provide clear guidance on how to address the challenges and needs of women in conflict with the law at various stages of the criminal justice process. So taken together with other UN standards and norms related to prison management and the treatment of offenders, such as the Tokyo Rules and the Nelson Mandela Rules, and most recently, the Kyoto Model Strategy on Reducing Reoffending. We have an internationally recognized and action-oriented normative framework in place to strengthen rehabilitation and reintegration outcomes. So anchored in these standards and norms, UNODC's work related to the prison management and also the penal reform is structured around three interrelated strategic objectives. First, reducing the scope of imprisonment by addressing the over-reliance on imprisonment and shifting towards prevention and restorative justice and non-custodial measures, especially for petty non-violent offenses that disproportionately affect women living in poverty. Second, improving prison management and conditions. Historically, prison systems and regimes have been designed by men and for men. Compliance with the Nelson Mandela Rules and the Bangkok Rules requires gender-responsive health care, protection from violence and abuse, and upholding family contact, just to mention a few measures to address the persisting challenges that women face. Third, supporting rehabilitation and social reintegration. Incarceration by itself does not have any reformative effect. Rehabilitation and social reintegration are central to public safety and to breaking cycles of exclusion and reoffending. These objectives also reflect the central approach outlined in the UN Common Position on Incarceration, which serves as a common framework for UN support to member states in this regard. To support member states to achieve the above referred objectives, UNODC provides assistance in legislation, policy and strategy development, capacity building, and also knowledge development and dissemination, etc. Meanwhile, delivering on these objectives requires the joint efforts of all relevant multi-stakeholders. Civil society organizations, including many represented here today, play a central role in bridging a gap between criminal justice systems and the communities. Their contributions to advocacy, support services, and reintegration programs are essential to sustaining progress. So to conclude, by undertaking comprehensive legislative and policy review, scaling up access to legal aid, investing in gender-responsive rehabilitation and reintegration procedures, and strengthening coordination and cooperation across relevant multi-stakeholders for a whole-of-society approach, the member states can reverse the rising trend of women imprisonment. So, UNODC stands, ready to continue working with all stakeholders in advancing this shared agenda. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lee. And now our last discussant, panelist, Shontit Shurna, Director of the Office for the Bangkok Rules and Treatment of Offenders at the Thailand Institute of Justice. And the TIJ, much led by Shontit's leadership, have been really tireless champion in these spaces, promoting Bangkok Rules globally. And so it's a pleasure to have you here today, please.
Thank you, Olivia, and good morning to you all. On behalf of the Thailand Institute of Justice, it is a privilege to be joining this important panel, and I would like to echo other speakers in thanking Penal Reform International, Women Beyond Walls, and Pathfinder for leading this discussion at the CSW for several years. So TIJ as an organization that we were established to promote and support the implementations of the Bangkok Rules. Our work is in the sections of women empowerment and criminal justice reform. We had an opportunity to engage with both commissions on the status of women and the UN Crime Commissions in Vienna. So today, I'd like to briefly reflect on how these two spaces are increasingly converging and why it is so important for us to advancing these inclusive justice for women. For far too long, women have been in prison, have been overlooked. And many of us in this room would recall as a champion of the rights of women in incarcerations in 2010, when the Bangkok Rule was adopted. We see that as a historic moment, the rights of women are being officially recognized. And the Bangkok Rule was the first international standard that looking into this issue. But that was 15 years ago. During this time, we see a dedicated efforts by civil societies and government in some countries. We're starting to see a shift and a small progress, if uneven, in recognizing specific needs of women and a growing recognitions of how inequality, poverty, and punitive drug policy have disproportionately affect women. Over the past 15 years, however, these issues of women in detention has remained largely confined with the boundary of crime and justice discourse. We've seen these issues, as Olivia mentions, in Vienna. We have discussed these issues in a few places. But these issues are primarily treated as a matter of criminal justice and prison reform, and rather than a broader questions of women's rights, protections, equalities, and social justice. And this separation has limited our collective ability to address the root cause of women's involvement in the justice system. In the region where I'm from, in Southeast Asia, I recall a regional policy dialogue where we as TIJ sought to ensure that women's prisoners' rights are included in these gender equality discussions. The response we encountered was telling. Some of the high-level seniors said to us that why not prioritize a more positive aspect of women empowerment? Why do we focus on women in prison? And this reflects, a deeper truth that discrimination, stigma, and bias faced by women in conflict with the law are not only present in society and their daily life, but is embedded within the policy discussion. And when the women's issues of women in prison and women in detention are treated in isolation, it risks reinforcing the very stigma that we try to address. It suggests that some women are less visible or less worthy of inclusions within a broader gender equality agenda. So why this CSW this year is such an exciting moment, it's so important for us. The adoptions of the agreed conclusions of the CSW70 represent a significant development. For the first time, as several speakers has mentioned, the issues of women in detention was explicitly recognized in the CSW outcome document. So allow me to highlight a few. In paragraph D, for instance, call for a comprehensive legislative review to identify and amend laws that discriminate against women and girls, including those that contribute to the disproportionate criminalizations and incarcerations of women. This is a clear acknowledgement of the CSW that criminalizations is shaped by structural inequalities as well as these punitive drug policies in so many regions. For example, in Asia Pacific, we have over 60% or in 70% in some countries was confined in prison because of small drug dealing. And I think this paragraph also reinforced the importance of proportionality, which is the principle of the criminal justice response, and provide a normative basis for us to reduce over-criminalizations and expand alternative to imprisonment. Paragraph P, for instance, call for addressing specific needs and circumstances of women across justice continuum, from arrest to sentencing. And paragraph MM emphasized the importance of timely, accessible, and affordable legal aid for women in detention. And this is particularly relevant in the context of pretrial detentions, as Dawn has already mentioned, where women who are deprived of liberties without having been convicted. And this is, we're talking about 1/3 of women in prison who are still fighting their case and not getting their freedom. And in this case, the principles of presumption of innocence must remain central. But in practice, pretrial detention is often influenced by factors of poverty, lack of resources, and also limited access to legal information, their rights, legal representation, legal aid. And this is a fundamental thing that to ensure that women can fight their case and preserve their dignity. So in closing, the relationship between gender and crime is deeply interconnected, and the pathway that brings women into contact with the criminal justice is often shaped by inequality, while justice responses shape women's life, opportunity, and outcome. And for this reason, this issue cannot be addressed in isolation. There must be part of an ongoing dialogue across both CSW, the UN commissions, and also the commissions on drug and narcotic drug. And this is encouraging to see this alignment start to take shape this year at CSW. And I think that is moving forward, we need to sustain this synergy and make sure that it will continue to be a cross-cutting issues and a commitment also not only from civil societies that are working very hard, but also from the member state and all the stakeholders to make sure that the gender responsive and practical reform can be made across the system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shantit and partners. Indeed, we should be taking these issues, and we will, to the Crime Congress when it takes place, hopefully later this year, and also, the Vienna commissions where these issues also need to be seen through a feminist gender equality lens. So now we will open the floor. I'm very happy that we have some time. But I would first, as part of that, give the floor to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, who have been central really supporting, pushing for women's criminalisation and detention through a human rights lens over the years, including in relation to drug policies. So you're very welcome. Christian, please.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. So many of the things I had to say have already been said. So let me maybe add a couple of examples and some developments. One, OICHR's 2025 report on women and girls in criminal justice detention found that women's incarceration is rooted in gender inequality and violence, discriminatory laws or gender discrimination in the application of the law, as well as the criminalization of certain acts such as abortion, sex work, sex outside marriage, often qualified as moral crimes, have disproportionately led to the incarceration of poor women. CEDAW calls for the eradication of gender stereotypes, and all of these crimes particularly focus on negative stereotypes, on the prosecution of what is perceived as being a non-chaste woman or a bad mother. So let me focus on the issue of criminalization of abortion or the exercise of sexual and reproductive rights. Two cases in point, the Manuela case versus El Salvador and the Beatriz case versus El Salvador in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Manuela is a case of prosecution of a woman that accesses the health system because there's a mandatory requirement of denunciation of a deed that might entail abortion or suspicion of abortion. So it's a poor woman that accesses the health system, and the physicians denounce her, and that triggers criminalization and finally conviction of the person. Beatriz is a case of a woman that is pregnant and there's two features that where medically prescribed abortions are given. One is risk for the mother because she has lupus, and second, an encephalic fetus, so an unviable fetus. Because of the absolute criminalization of poverty, the physicians do not perform the prescribed abortion because they fear criminal prosecution. So of course the fetus dies as soon as he's born. In a side event to CSW, there was an interesting show of an Argentinian film, Belén, by Dolores Fonsi, which is streaming in Prime Amazon, so I recommend the film, that shows exactly a similar case in Argentina that actually triggered the movement for legal abortion, of a complete violation of the rule of law, of the right to defense, and a reversal of the presumption of innocence on the basis of the witch hunt of prosecution of someone who's seen as a bad mother. So recommend the film for that. So in the UN Common Position on Incarceration, the UN system pledges to support reform efforts aimed at ensuring proportionate and individualized sentencing policies and alternatives to conviction or punishment in appropriate cases, including for minor drug-related offenses. The UN system equally commits to advocate for decriminalization of acts that are protected by international human rights law, such as the exercise of sexual and reproductive rights. OSCHR, the human rights treaty bodies, including the Human Rights Committee, CEDAW, the CERS, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and special procedures of the Human Rights Council, have recommended decriminalization of certain conducts whose criminal prescription is not in conformity with general principles of criminal law and international human rights law. For example, with respect to conduct that involves the legitimate and lawful exercise and enjoyment of human rights, such as access to health care, sex work, homelessness, or begging. Such criminalization leads to arbitrary detention and disproportionately sentencing, sometimes for conduct that has not even been the woman's choice. I have to say that in many of these cases, upper or middle class women would have never been prosecuted by the system. So in these cases, it's only poor women that access a public hospital and then are prosecuted, or even in places where abortion is criminalized, middle and upper class women can easily take a flight and go to a place where abortion is legal, or even get a safe abortion within the country, because that's in a private clinic that's never criminalized. So it's only poor women that access public services that are under the risk of prosecution. In addressing this challenge, OSCHR, UNAIDS, and UNDP supported the development of the so-called 8 March principles of a human rights-based approach to criminal law, prescribing conduct associated with sex, reproduction, drug use, HIV, homelessness, and poverty, that was all elaborated under the auspices of an NGO, the International Commission of Jurists. The principles provide practical legal guidance and the application of criminal law and the decriminalization of conducts associated with the above areas, including those related to poverty. The principles are unequivocal. Criminal law may only prescribe conduct causing substantial harm to others. Poverty-related conducts and behaviors must be decriminalized. Pursuant to these principles, OSCHR stands ready to support states and other stakeholders to move forward to decriminalize acts protected for the realization of the rights of women. Thank you.
Thank you so much for mentioning also the 8 March principles, which is a very useful document around decriminalisation, and that reminds me that the 3 co-organisers collaborate together actually under a global campaign to decriminalise poverty and status, which is a coalition of organisations across the world, which started around petty offences but now has expanded to all kind of poverty-related or status-related criminalisation. So if you want any resources, that campaign is really helpful. Would anybody like to make a comment or a question? Okay, here, please.
So I just want to thank you all for making the invisible visible. and congratulations on this groundbreaking achievement of getting mentioned in the agreed conclusions. My name is Nellie Bisram. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. I live in South Florida. I'm the CEO and founder of an organization that one of the things that we do is we support, we provide some psychosocial supports, mindfulness-based support for folks that are incarcerated. But I also sit on the local CSW in Broward County, Florida, where we have something called the Baker Act, which criminalizes folks who are experiencing mental health challenges and are causing either self-harm or harm to others. And there is no difference between the treatment of those who are self-harming and those who are causing harm to others. And there is a member of my family who has experienced this. And everything that you described around who is most affected, who gets incarcerated is right on. And so listening to you, I'm now inspired to really bring this before our local CSW. And I guess my question is for, around how can we kind of weave in the lessons that you've learned so we can take a wiser walk in our journey and to avoid some of the pitfalls, because we do live in a very conservative state. So I'm counting on my sister from Tennessee maybe to be able to lean into some of your experience. But I think in terms of what opportunities might be available to learn from some of your success stories, and I mean perhaps site visits or even, calls, or how can we get involved with the international network as well? Thank you.
So I totally understand being from a conservative state as well, and in the midst of that, we've also been able to change. We just changed another law this year, so 4 laws so far in Tennessee, and do other policy work, and a lot of it is getting the constituents involved as well. Just like in the South, we know there's so many rural communities. Like the bigger cities in my state don't determine a state outcome. It's the smaller rural communities. And so really getting those folks, those constituents who are also deeply affected and a lot of times don't have access to the different resources that may be in the larger communities, involved in contacting their legislators as well. So that's one of my main contributions, and I can talk to you afterwards about the international network. Thank you.
We love connecting people.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I am the co-convener of the United States Women's Caucus Young Women's Advocacy Group. And my question really looks at the lens of girls as we look towards the criminal justice system. In my own community, I've seen how drug offenses are treated differently between boys and girls, and how that difference can set girls up to fail long term when we're looking at admissions to colleges and universities and job training programs. I've seen girls who are identified as using weed and other low-level drugs be kicked out of all activities, all AP courses, which essentially kicks them out of any chance of accessing a good university and a good job training program, no matter what that is. So I guess my question is, how do we as civil society and NGOs truly engage girls who are stuck on this pipeline, the school to prison pipeline, and really break that cycle before it can truly begin to affect them in adulthood?
Well, I can speak to this end. So one thing also about the criminalization of moms and parents is that there are many statistics that show that the children of incarcerated parents, so essentially the girls whose mom or parents are incarcerated, are more likely to be incarcerated themselves. And so a lot of what we do is meeting children of incarcerated parents, but not exclusively, but girls whose families are incarcerated, and really pouring into them so that we can interrupt some of the school to prison pipeline. Along those same lines is that we often see this this pathway to like behavior incidents and suspensions, and then go into alternative, and a lot of times alternative is the next thing before juvenile detention, and maybe sometimes there's a juvenile detention stay that's quick, and then the next one is like you're facing adult charges. And so being able to capture girls when they are getting the behavior incidents or the suspensions, and being able to advocate for them. Sometimes what we see with that is advocating for also people with different levels of ability, and being able to advocate for them to be able to be recognized for their disabilities. But whatever the case is, really, when you start seeing those disciplinaries and those suspensions and stuff stepping in, and also girls whose parents are incarcerated. Thank you.
And I will add one thing, that it's crazy in 2026, but we don't actually know how many girls are in detention globally. There's kind of vague estimates, and that is, I think, very telling in itself, that there isn't even the kind of data to work on and evidence. And we need more research to also be able to know what is the situation.
Thank you, Olivia, and also thank you very much for this question. We really think it's very important also to do the awareness raising on the available mechanisms to provide such support, and also resources, as Olivia mentioned just now, to just let everybody know the channels and mechanisms where they can get support, and also where they can make their voice, and their voice can be listened at different levels of policy making processes. Because we know at the UN level, it's really strongly encouraged to have the participatory methodology to discuss and do the decision making. And for example, as the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, it meets every year in May, but this year in June. If you look at the website, there are also, the channels for civil society to attend. So you can bring this request, this information to that level, bring it to the attention of member states, working on the agencies of rules works basically on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. I feel terrible. There's many hands up, but there is another event after this, so we have to be fair to the other topics. I think the next one is on AI. I can do an advert. Mike give us a few more minutes. But I do want to give the floor to Sabrina, founder of Women Beyond Walls, to share a few final reflections to take away, and I think a few of us will be hanging out at the Vienna Cafe after to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for your excellent moderation. So we've heard from so many speakers that this is a historic moment, that this is one of the first times that we've had women in detention in the approved conclusions. So how do we build on that? And I want to offer 5 recommendations. The first is inclusion. We heard so powerfully from Dawn and other speakers about how critical it is to involve women with lived experience of the criminal legal system in forums and spaces, in shaping policies that have impacted them. And I also want to acknowledge Virginia, who's also here from the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women. And we also need to bring in other actors as well, like civil society groups. We need to come together. And I want to throw out a real call to UN agencies to make sure that this happens. The Crime Congress is happening, where we've actually have an event with the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, PRITIJ. But it's really difficult to have women who have criminal convictions to get visas to go to these events. It's almost nearly impossible. And actually a woman yesterday who we work with, a wonderful woman, Cheryl Wilkins, said to me, this is a life sentence. Even when we're released, it's still a life sentence because we have so many barriers. So I really hope that UN agencies will work with us and women with lived experience to make sure we can get women to these forums, because I think that's really critical. Inclusion. Secondly, data. Again, many speakers have told you the lack of data. You've heard some really concerning statistics. 740,000 women in prison, 19,000 children in prison with their mothers, 1.4 million children who have a mother in prison. But let me tell you what keeps me awake at night. That's probably just the tip of the iceberg. We really do not know. So we need more data. The Bangkok Rules and the UN Common Position on Incarceration say that prison should be a last resort. So if states are actually complying with this, it means we should be seeing the number of women in prison decreasing. But how do we know if we don't even know the number? So we absolutely need to come together to get much more data. Inclusion, data. Thirdly, prioritization. You've heard here today about how this has been an invisibilized population. This has been an issue that hasn't been included. But we're seeing steps in the right direction. So I really want to encourage, particularly because we are in the UN, that this has to become a much more important part of the UN agenda. We need all UN agencies, UN Women, UNODC, UNDP, all UN agencies to collaborate and make sure that this is firmly part of the agenda. But also in shaping the work you're doing, we really urge you to work with women with lived experience, work with civil society organizations. We've been doing this work for decades. We know where are the needs. Let us work together. And just to really make sure we have to focus on decriminalizing poverty. I think that has been one of the strongest calls that has come out here. We do not need to criminalize women for poverty. As Mary Robinson said, poverty is not gender neutral. We have just 4 years before the 2030 agenda. We have just 4 years before the 20-year anniversary of the Bangkok Rules. And we're on track to reach 1 million women in prison with the data we know. So this is a clarion call to everybody. How can we, in the next 4 years, really reverse this trend? So more prioritization. So we've had inclusion, data prioritization, now funding. As you've heard, this area is one of the least resourced areas on women's rights. I know we're in a funding crisis now, but what concerns me is this area that was never funded anyway is going to be even more overlooked. So really, donors, UN agencies, this work is vital. We've seen so much change. You've heard things that have absolutely changed in this work, but we need funding for it. And that means core flexible funding, not just project funding, which funds people to do a few projects, but not to fund themselves or to keep the lights on. But also I want to talk about funding more broadly. Are we investing money in building more prisons that we know cause harm, or are we investing that money in community-based solutions? And lastly, I want to say, I think the last recommendation, the fifth one, is destigmatization. Stigma is one of the biggest barriers to progress on this work. We've heard so much about the stigma that women face. Cheryl Wilkins, a formerly incarcerated woman, yesterday said that we have to start before the arrest, not just thinking about the arrest, but all of the systemic barriers that bring women into the justice system, and state failures, poverty, racism, gender discrimination. Prison was invented by men for men, and prison is a feminist issue. And I think, as Chontit said, we need to see this not as just a criminal justice issue, but a women's rights issue. Every single person in this room has the power to change something. Just even sharing some of these resources, listening to a podcast which features women who've been in prison or feminist lawyers.
Sorry, Sabrina, we're getting pressure
One
from outside.
minute, less than 1 minute. Making sure that your work does include this issue. I am really sad so many times when I see a women's rights forum or meeting that doesn't include women who've been incarcerated. And lastly, just changing the language we use. Not using words like offender, using person-first language. So just a huge thank you to all of the sponsors and partners. This work is truly a collaborative work. We are absolutely strong together. And a huge thank you to Mary Robinson for her time